Hey, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to a new season of Claims Corner, which is formerly known as our Flood News at Noon. And I know a lot of y'all have probably participated with us before and been on our Flood News at Noon. And, over the last 2 years, we've been here at CNC bringing you leaders, experts in the insurance industry. About topics related to flood and flood perspective. And that was part of what our Flood News at Noon concept was. And I will point out one thing: if you missed any of those episodes that we did over the last 2 years, you can find some of those episodes actually on our YouTube channel, CNC Catastrophe National Claims YouTube channel. And I can barely say that, YouTube channel. All right. But in response to the growing popularity of Flood News at Noon, we have decided here, and we're excited to announce that we are taking this program to the next level. We're including topics that are related to property as well. And thus you have our CNC's Claims Corner. So really, no matter where you are out there, if you're in Hawaii, if you're in California, if you're in Florida, if you're in the UK, CNC's Claims Corner is going to be similar to what Flood News at Noon was and give you a perspective into a specific topic that's now going to not only be flood, but also include property as well. And that's what that's how we started this whole process 2 years ago, is when the pandemic hit and everybody was shut down and captured and not able to get out and go to classes and go to training and things like that. We thought it'd be a great idea to bring the subject matter experts, people who are experts in the industry that give you a completely different perspective on a specific topic. And that's how the Flood News at Noon developed. And that's how this whole Claims Corner will be evolved in for the next few episodes as well. With just like we did with Flood News at Noon, we have some fantastic speakers this year again. We have some let's say some guests that just won't leave, like our guest today. He's always been on here, but he always provides a great topic and great perspective and gives us some insight that, we may know the topic a little bit, we may understand it, but then we have an expert that comes along and helps us to completely understand even more specifically about how they see things, how they're dealing with stuff, and how they deal on the other side. Because a lot of times we get involved in the claims side of things and we don't really focus on the bigger picture. And with the way we're setting up the Claims Corner, way the Flood News at Noon was set up, is to be able to bring that all together, to bring this information all together. So we have some great, and again, like I said, we have some great topics this year that we're going to present. We have some great speakers, new speakers, some old, some quote old speakers that are with us. So before we get started, though, I do want to thank a couple people. First of all, I want to thank Sinneth. I want to thank Jeremiah. I want to thank Julie. I want to thank David, all on the our marketing team, our training team, and every team in between. And I'm sure there's a lot of people I haven't included on this. Thank you, but they've been very, very instrumental in putting this together. Because the reality of it is, this is a massive undertaking to be able to bring all these speakers in, to get everybody coordinated, to organize them, to put the videos together, to edit the information, to make sure that when it is presented, it's presented professionally in the proper way, and you're getting really valuable information. And that's what's really key. Because like I said, when we started Flood News Noon, that was our point, to get this information over to y'all. We have a lot of information we provide. We have a lot of experts provide, and we can bring all this together. And it helps everybody in the industry just continuously grow and develop and get a great opportunity. And I also want to thank you all as well. Thank you all for joining us every other Thursday at noon for, now as we call it, Claims Corner, to taking the time out to spend an hour with us to get engaged and hear and listen to what we have to say. And like I said, you're hopefully you're always going to learn something new and exciting. So with that, I would like to, I'm going to turn this over to Julie, because she is actually going to introduce us and start out with talking about introducing to one of our quote old, and I don't mean old as in like he's been around a while. He just, old, one of our old speakers. So Julie, I'll turn it over to you now.
Okay. Today, our guest speaker is Dr. Hal Needham, who is a climate data and natural hazards scientist. For the past 17 years, he has worked with disaster prone communities to make them more resilient from natural hazards. He is the lead scientist for the flood information systems and the primary content creator for Geotech, a brand that investigates the relationship between people and the environment, with a focus on extreme weather, natural disasters, and exploring nature. His Geotech podcast connects professionals with many from many sectors, including insurance, architecture, public health, urban planning, and adventure travel. Needham joined the CNC family in 2018 and resides in Galveston, Texas, site of the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. Please welcome Hal Needham.
Craig and Julie, thank you so much for the warm introduction. I'm going to share my screen here. Really great to be with everyone. Thank you so much for your encouragement. Last year, it was so fun to present at Flood News at noon, and really exciting to be here this year with Claims Corner. You know, every time when Craig mentions that I'm an old speaker, I'm always trying to figure out if it's just because I'm a returning speaker or if it's just that I have more gray hair is what I'm usually trying to figure out. Just one second here, we'll get the slideshow going. Special thank you as well to Seneth and Jeremiah for helping me get set up and just helping put all this together. As Craig mentioned, it takes a lot of people to get these webinars and these seminars going, but it's been so great interacting with so many of you in the past, and I'm really excited to share this presentation with you today. Today's presentation is called Snow and Ice Impacts on the Built Environment, and a look at cold weather too. Now, some of you might be saying, hang on a second, isn't this Hurricane Hal, the guy that does so much hurricane coverage and tropical weather stuff? What does that have to do with snow, ice, and cold? And that's a good question. As Julie mentioned, I'm a climate data and natural hazard scientist, so I do a lot more than just tropical weather. But this talk actually had me looking back into my past, and I started thinking about where I've spent my winters, and I realized I've spent over 30 winters of my life in cold, snowy places. So I grew up in the Northeast. I spent 28 winters in Pennsylvania and upstate New York in the snow belt. I spent 2 winters in Alaska where it was very cold, a winter in Boulder, Colorado, with a lot of time in the southeastern Wyoming mountains, 2 winters in Africa where I actually saw snow both of those winters in the Atlas Mountains of Morocco. And then the last 14 winters, I've been along the Gulf Coast, and I was surprised to see what a big impact winter weather has all the way down to the I-10 corridor. And so we'll be talking about perspectives from these different places that I've lived and places that I've traveled for work. So growing up, I grew up in East Central Pennsylvania. Here's a photograph of my dad, and my sister and I are on the sled. We got a lot of big snowstorms where I grew up. We'd get snow days a lot in the wintertime, and sledding was always a favorite thing. You know, when a lot of you think about going fishing with dad, you're probably thinking about getting out in a boat. When I think about it, a lot of times I have pictures like this in my head of going out to our frozen lake at Twin Lakes, where we'd get ice cover on the lake, usually 2 to 3 months every winter. And my dad's there with a hand auger to drill a hole in the ice so we could go fishing. So this time of the year, if you want to fish up there, you're doing ice fishing. And so I was very familiar with getting out on the ice to go ice skating and ice fishing. As an adult, I got into a sport called snowshoe racing. This is long distance running on snowpack. I actually ran races in 6 different states and ran in 2 national championships. And, you know, with the Winter Olympics now, I always wanted to be a winter sports athlete. And I kind of had that dream realized in 2004, 2005. I actually had my own sports card. I was doing long distance racing and snowpack, and I ran in national championships both of those years. It was a lot of fun. I was good enough to barely qualify for the national championships, but I didn't do much there. I might finish, I think I finished 36th in the country once. The guy on the left, my training partner, actually won nationals one year. This is a photograph of us near Lake Tahoe in the Sierras. But actually all that time racing and running in snow, I began to see there's a lot of different types of snow. Sometimes snow is heavy and wet. Sometimes it's dry and powdery. Sometimes there's an icy crust on it. And just getting out, traveling to different parts of the country, running these races really showed me a lot about winter weather and snow. This is a picture from when I lived in Alaska. No snow in this picture, but it would be coming pretty quickly. This was in Brevig Mission, Alaska, very close to the Russian border, actually, by the Bering Sea. Out there, you can see the houses are elevated. And this picture was taken in late September. I installed a weather station out there, and they get snow cover from early October until at least April every year. I saw a lot of snow and cold during my time in Alaska. And then lastly, when I lived in Colorado, I worked for the National Snow and Ice Data Center. So I did a lot of projects related with snow cover and snowpack around the world. And that just really helped me understand more as well about snow and ice in the climate picture. So even though I've lived on the Gulf Coast and I really enjoyed the time over in Mobile with our CNC family, I've actually spent quite a bit of my life in snow and ice and dealing with that professionally and personally. And we'll be talking about that today in our presentation. So really, it's going to be a very, very simplistic presentation. I'm going to talk about 4 winter hazards: heavy snow, ice storms, ice jam floods, and extreme cold. I'll be talking about the meteorology behind these hazards, the impacts on people, and then some mitigation options on how we can lessen their impacts on society and on our personal lives. So without further ado, let's hop to it. Let's talk about heavy snow. So something that's always interesting this time of the year. This is a photograph out of my bedroom window in 1993. I used to love waking up and seeing this picture. It meant you're not going to have school today and probably not going to have school tomorrow either. Those bumps you see in the driveway, those are our cars. They're just buried. And so the bad part about that, it was my job to dig those out. We didn't have a snow blower back in the day. You had to dig that out by hand. You can see how much snow there was in March of 93. And actually, I used to shovel snow for a lot of the neighbors too. It was quite a workout back there in the day. But we'd get some pretty big snowstorms. This was the superstorm of 1993. Some people call it the storm of the century. It dumped tremendous amounts of snow, actually more than 10 inches of snow from Alabama and Georgia all the way up the Appalachians. Where I lived, I think there was about 18 inches of snow from that event. This is a kind of storm that we call nor'easters, and we're going to be talking about that. What is a nor'easter? Well, a nor'easter happens when we have these areas of high pressure over Canada or New England. High pressure, usually you have fair skies, light winds, and very cold weather in the wintertime. Low pressure we associate with stormy weather, rain and snow and precipitation. And so when you have this high over Eastern Canada or New England, it has a lot of cold air. And then you get these low pressures moving up the coast with a lot of moisture and storminess. Where those overlap, you often get some really big snowstorms there along the Northeast urban corridor. And so we might assume that the closer you are to the storm track, the more snow you're going to get, but that's not exactly true. The storm itself, where we have the low pressure center, tends to be relatively mild. And so really where that storm, the low pressure tracks, you're going to get a lot of rain. But then when you start moving inland, you get a mix of rain, snow, and ice. And then farther to the west, you'll get a band of pretty big shield of snow that's farther inland. When I lived in the Northeast, these were exciting storms to track as a kid. And generally, it all really depends on the storm track. If the storm track's farther inland, everything shifts to the west. And so the big cities, Washington, Baltimore, Philly, New York, Boston, they're going to see rain. You're going to have really ice and a mix over the Appalachians, and then snow farther west by Pittsburgh and Buffalo and into Canada. But if the storm tracks farther to the east, everything shifts to the east. The rain mostly stays off the coast. And then generally the big cities like Philly, New York, and Boston, you're going to get a lot of snow from those events. So a lot has to do with the storm track and how much cold air is in place. And again, these are really high profile storms. The other thing that's interesting is usually when the storm system is centered off the coast and south of you is really when you get the biggest snow. So this is called the Delmarva Peninsula here near north of Norfolk, Virginia. When the storms were really parked off the Virginia coast or even the Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, that was really when we were getting a lot of snow in Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Here on this weather map, even though the storm is out here to sea, Wilkes-Barre Scranton in this weather map is getting snow with a wind from the northeast. That's one reason they're called nor'easters. Usually when you're getting your big snow, the wind's coming down from the northeast, you're getting moisture and you're getting cold air coming down from Canada. A lot of these storms are so big that we call them blizzards. And so one of the biggest storms on record in the Northeast was the blizzard of 1888. It just pounded New York City and the whole Northeast urban corridor. My grandfather's great-grandfather actually passed away in this storm. They had a farm not far from where the Bronx in New York City is today. And the conditions were so severe, the legend in my family is that they actually put my grandfather's great-grandfather out in the barn for probably days to weeks because they just couldn't bury his body, and it was frigid out there. They just kept his body out in the barn, I think, for days or maybe a week until they could, shovel the snow and actually dig a grave. It might have actually been longer than that, but he definitely died in this blizzard. In common language in the Northeast, when they talk about blizzards, most people just mean a heavy snowfall. But technically, The actual meteorological definition of a blizzard is different than that. It always involves strong winds. And so we just had a blizzard 2 weekends ago in New England. When you look at the National Weather Service map, if there's a blizzard, they'll shade blizzard warnings in orange. The criteria for an actual blizzard, for at least 3 hours, you need sustained winds or frequent wind gusts of greater than 35 miles an hour, and visibility needs to be reduced to less than a quarter mile in falling or blowing snow. So you actually don't need it to be snowing to get a blizzard. In Western Alaska, they often have ground blizzards. There's already snow on the ground. A major windstorm moves in with winds in excess of 35 miles an hour, and the visibility goes down to near zero. Even though it's not snowing, it's a blizzard. So really a blizzard is when you have these strong winds and either falling or blowing snow. So blizzards are a big deal. We talk about them when they hit the Northeast urban corridor because they have such high impacts. When we hear about snowstorms in places like New York and Boston, they're so high profile and they hit the media so much, we might assume that the coastal cities are where the big snow is. It's where the high profile events are, but when you look at the annual average snowfall, places like New York and Philadelphia actually don't see that much snow. On this map, you can see they're shaded in gray. Both New York and Philly get less than 25 inches of snow per year. The big snow in this part of the country is really northern New England and the Adirondacks of New York, and areas just to the east of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, where we have lake effect snow. You can see this bullseye here where you see over 200 inches of snow. That's a place called the Tug Hill Plateau, and I'll be showing you some pictures from there. I spent some time up there this winter. It's the snowiest area east of the Rocky Mountains. Let's talk about lake effect snow. When cold air out of Canada passes over the relatively warm waters of the Great Lakes, we get these big lake snows just downwind from the lakes, typically to the southeast of lakes. This map is a little bit generalized. It's showing the highest snow actually up here in the UP of Michigan. It's missing some of the details here from the Tug Hill Plateau near Lake Ontario. But I like this map because it really shows you, I mean, look at Lake Michigan. To the east of the lake, you get these big snows annually, but you get out into Wisconsin, the average annual snows drop off quite a bit. And so that's really the impact of lake effect snow. Lake effect snow, again, happens when cold air passes over the relatively warm waters of the lake. That really produces a lot of evaporation and moisture into the air, but cold air cannot hold that much moisture. So as it gets closer to the eastern shore of these lakes and it starts to rise in elevation, when it hits land, it precipitates, and we get these big lake effect snow events, usually to the east or to the southeast of the Great Lakes. Lake effect snow is very localized. Look at this map from Christmas week of 2000, and you'll see here, Syracuse, New York is where we have these crossroads, but just south of Pulaski, there's a little bullseye here. Over 3 feet of snow from this lake effect event, Christmas week of 2000. Look what happens exactly 1 year later. Watch this pattern and watch how it shifts. This is 2000, this is 2001. That area that had the bullseye the year before, in 2001, they have about 7 or 8 inches of snow, but just about maybe 40, 45 miles to the northeast, some areas got more than 108 inches of snow. This is an area I spent time in this winter. The local said it snowed 1 or 2 feet per day for like 5 or 6 days straight. It just never stopped. But again, it can be very localized. You can get a couple feet of snow in one location and a few miles away get very little snow. It all depends on the wind direction and the trajectory of the snow. Another very localized lake effect snow event happened in 2014. Look at this bullseye just south of Buffalo, but the city of Buffalo really did not get that much snow. We read in the National Weather Service report on this storm, over 5 feet of snow fell over areas just east of Buffalo, with mere inches a few miles to the north. Could you imagine if you lived a few miles away from where you worked? Maybe you're a school teacher, and where you work, they only got 3 inches of snow, but you're calling in to tell them at your house, which is just 3 miles away, you got 5 feet of snow. That's unbelievably localized snow, and that's what happens in some of these lake effect snow events. That happens because of something called training. You can actually do a YouTube video on the radar loop for this event, and basically these strolls of heavy snow were just moving off from southwest to northeast for more than a day, just like a train. The heaviest snow was just moving on this train track, and you can see how sharp this boundary is. You get into the city of Buffalo, there wasn't that much snow. Just south of the city, in some places, more than 5 feet. You can YouTube video this as well. It's fascinating. This snow came in, it almost looked like a curtain. And when you run the video, it shows this curtain of snow moving from right to left across the screen. Again, where this camera is, it's not snowing at all. A couple miles away, it might be snowing 4 or 5 inches an hour. These are very localized events. People in this part of the world are very used to heavy snow, but still, it's really hard for anyone to deal with snow rates like 4 or 5 inches an hour. It's just, I've driven through this and you can't even really sometimes look out your windshield. I've driven on I-81 in a place called Central Square. I had to look at an angle to see where the snowbank was to stay on the road. Even on low beams, I couldn't look straight ahead. My visibility was very close to zero. So it can be really dangerous. Now, let's talk about places in the country that get the most snow. The most snow in the country is actually the Pacific Northwest in the high mountain peaks of the Cascades. Places like Mount Rainier, Mount Hood, they get 300, 400, 500 inches of snow per year. Thompson Pass in Alaska comes in there very close. I think it's third from what I saw on the list. So those get really the big snowfall, but really less impact sometimes directly than the big cities in the Northeast. There's something called the Golden Snow Globe competition. You can go to goldensnowglobe.com. And this is the current, it's a contest to see which city, which big city defined as at least 100,000 people, which big city is the snowiest. And so this is updated probably twice a week. I looked last week and Buffalo, New York is actually leading the list right now, 73 inches so far this year. Rochester, New York comes in second, and Anchorage, Alaska comes in third. Syracuse, New York has won this competition more than any other city. They've won it 4 times in the 14 years or so that it's been running. So again, upstate New York not only gets a lot of snow, but they get a lot of snow affecting a lot of people. And so it's big impact. And so it's something that, you know, we always keep an eye on. But again, all throughout the Great Lakes, you go to Ohio, you go to Indiana and Michigan, some of these areas are pretty well populated and have a lot of snow impacts as well. Let's get back to this 2014 Buffalo snow event. You know, you're in the snow belt, you're prepared for heavy snows, but look at the impacts of this event. There were 14 fatalities with this storm, hundreds of major roof collapses and structural failures, thousands of stranded motorists, scattered food and gas shortages due to impassable roads. Numerous trees also gave way due to the weight of the snow, causing isolated power outages. I'm telling you, upstate New York is well prepared for snow, but no one can deal with it snowing 4 or 5 inches an hour. Even these structures that are built for heavy snow loads could not deal with it. They had hundreds of major roof collapses. And this happened really a couple of years ago as well near Binghamton, New York. They're not in the heart of the lake effect snow belt. I lived there for 2 years, but they got 39 inches of snow in 2 days and they had major roof collapses. Actually, the Greater Binghamton Sports Complex roof completely collapsed. Fortunately, no one was inside. But looking at these pictures, you can get the idea that roof collapses could definitely be fatal. And in the best case scenario, they're just a big economic loss. So we really need to think about this when we build in snow country, how we can build to handle these heavy snow loads. This is a photograph off my grandma's back porch, probably taken in the 80s. You can see icicles there. Icicles are beautiful, but they also tell a story. When you have icicles coming off a roof, what's happening is you have a snow load on the roof. And you're actually melting that snow either through sunlight or through heat escaping from the house. And when that melted water runs to the edge of the roof and starts dripping off, it refreezes because the temperature on my grandma's thermometer there, I don't know, the temperature might have been 27 when this photo was taken. So it's still sub-freezing, but there is melting going on the roof. It looks pretty, but it can be a dangerous thing. Icicles can fall off high buildings and hurt or kill people. The other thing that can happen when snow melts on a roof is you can get something called an ice dam. And an ice dam looks like this. You have snow load on the roof, you have heat that, you know, maybe you have a little bit inefficiency in the insulation. So heat is getting up into the roof. It's melting the snow load. And as the water melts off and goes towards the edge of the roof, notice out here you have something called eave. So you don't have heating anymore. It's cold out here. You get icicles. You also get this ridge of ice along the edge of the roof called an ice dam. The problem is that actually dams up the future melted water that's running to get off the roof, and it can back that water up underneath shingles. I've been working with, you know, in the flood space for more than a decade. I go to a flood workshops and conferences. I've heard people say everyone can flood, everyone flood insurance, and I've often thought that's not really true. My parents live on top of a mountain. I mean, if they flooded, everyone would flood. So not everyone can flood. You can imagine my surprise last winter when my mom called me to tell me their house was flooding. And I thought, there's no way. Turns out they had an ice dam. So ice dams tend to form especially on a roof that does not have a steep slope. This is a cross view of their house. They had an ice dam on this upper roof. You can see the slope on this is not very great. The slope on these other roofs is greater, and they did not have ice dams there, but they did get an ice dam on this roof with a gentler slope. It backed water up under the shingles and down through the walls, and they had a real mess to clean up as this was continuing day and night, and there was really no way to stop it once it started. So the good news about an ice dam is that even though winter weather can affect people all the way down to the Gulf Coast, you really need prolonged snow on the roof and prolonged cold to. I'm going to say you need at least 10 days of continuous cold below freezing day and night with a snow load on the roof. I talked to a roofer in Watertown, New York on the Canadian border. He told me you need like 3 weeks or more of these conditions to get an ice dam. I mean, I think it really could be less than that if you had the ingredients in place. But the point is, if you get a heavy snow in Atlanta, Georgia, that's probably going to melt in a couple days. And so you're not going to get an ice dam if you're in the deep south. But this is more of a problem in the north central, northeast, even the Rocky Mountain states. I've talked to people that have had ice dam problems there as well. These are pictures from Tug Hill, New York. Again, this area east of the Rocky Mountains. When you drive around Tug Hill in these places that get 250, 300 inches of snow per year, you see a lot of metal roofs with very steep slopes. Those are made by design to really get these big snow loads to slide off the roofs. These are pictures I took this last December in Tug Hill. You can just see everywhere I looked, I'm seeing these really steep roofs with metal siding. This is interesting. The A-frame already had the snow slide off of it. The barn, you can see the slope of this roof is not as steep. And so the snow is in the process of sliding off. It may take a couple more hours or even another day or two for this snow to slide off. It's not moving really quickly. A lot of the snow is sliding very slowly, but it does slide off of these roofs. I took this picture. If I took this picture 10 minutes later, it probably would have looked the same. You really can't see the snow moving, but it's slowly sliding off these roofs. It might take a day or two, or, I don't know, maybe less than that, but it takes some time for the snow to slide off. The steeper the roof, the more the surface of it, if it has a metal roof, it's going to slide better as well. I talked to a lot of people, and I've seen this in Canada, I've seen this in Alaska, people getting up on their roofs to shovel the heavy snow load off. And people even do this as a business up there, to come and shovel your roof. I did a podcast with a woman named Leona that's lived in Tug Hill or around there her whole life. She said in 2009, they actually had to bring out the track hoe and actually use heavy machinery to scrape snow off the roof. They're very aware of the impact of heavy snow loads on roofs up there, and they'll do what they have to do to get it off. Now, sometimes you don't want snow to slide off a roof. This is a picture I took in Camden, New York, of a parking lot, and they had a caution sign here that falling ice and snow could injure people or injure their vehicles, basically. So this is a parking lot where they did not want snow to fall off the roof or slide off the roof. Inside this hardware store, they actually had something called a snow guard that you could buy. And this is a piece of plastic that you can put on the roof to actually keep the snow from sliding off. So structurally, we want the snow off our roof, but depending if you have pedestrians or a lot of traffic nearby, you may not want the snow to slide off your roof. Snow Ridge Ski Resort in Tug Hill, they explained it to me like this. They want the snow off the roof, but in certain places, you're thinking more about people's safety. So this is a photograph I took in December. You can see they've put snow guards here above the doors. So they want to kind of keep the snow on the roof above the doors because they don't want it to hit people. But when you get away from the doors, they'd prefer that the snow slides off. This is, a complex thing. You have to think about your building. You have to think about the functionality. You have to think about pedestrian traffic. And what I found is people are trying to find the sweet spot where they're getting snow off the roof, but they're not endangering people below. Again, upstate New York, man, you start driving around their towns. They have something called villages up there. The smaller towns are called villages. Villages, towns, cities, the state, there's snow plows everywhere. It can snow a foot, 2 feet. Everyone's out driving around. They're very capable to deal with it. People are driving, people have four-wheel drive, but there are snow plows everywhere. It's pretty impressive how they attack the snow up there. So anyway, that's my spiel on heavy snow. Pretty fascinating subject. Let's talk now about ice storms, and let's talk about this weather map. So in this weather map, basically we have cold air pushing down from the north in places like Dallas. At this time, they probably would have changed from rain over to sleet or maybe even some snow. In places like Mobile and Tuscaloosa, we have warm air coming up from the Gulf. That warm air is trying to go north, and it's trying to get up to Tennessee and Kentucky, but there's a problem. When the warm air tries to go north, there's something in physics where cold air is denser and heavier than warm air. And so the warm air goes on top, goes above the cold air. If you had superpowers to fly through the air and to see through the atmosphere, say you were in Kentucky and you're looking west, let's look at this area here that is prone to get ice in this situation. If you were looking to the west and you were in Kentucky, we would see to our south in Tennessee, we're starting with snow in the clouds, and this warm air has pushed in. There's so much warm air that basically it has melted all the snow, and it's just falling as rain. But when we get up into Kentucky in this storm, you can see that there's a wedge of cold air here down by the surface. And so the snow is melting, it's becoming rain, it's falling as rain. If you looked outside the window, you'd say it's raining, but it's actually glazing on the surface. And I'm just making this up. I'm saying the temperature at the surface maybe it was 28 degrees. So the rain is actually freezing rain. It's freezing on the sidewalk. It's freezing on cars. It's sub-freezing. It looks like rain, but it's basically glazing. Where we go a little farther north, again, our wedge of warm air is a little bit thinner farther north. We start as snow, we melt that snow, but then the cold air here is thick enough that it's refreezing these raindrops into sleet pellets. So it's basically, it's sleeting. It's like little bouncing pellets of ice called sleet. It's also very slippery. And then when we go farther north than that, say into Ohio and Indiana on this map, it's just all snow. The warm air has not reached that area, and it's just snowing. And so maybe the temperature there on the surface is 21. If we forget about this map and just look at an area that's snowing, it can snow actually as warm as 34 or 35 degrees. If you have cold air above you and your yesterday was frigid where you live, when I was a kid, there was a 10-inch snowstorm one time, and the temperature throughout the whole snowstorm was 34. So the previous day had been very cold, so the ground was cold, and the air above was cold. And so you can actually get snowstorms 33, 34, up to around 35 degrees. Let's talk again about ice, though, because ice has a really big impact. A lot depends on the surface temperature of the ground. I took these pictures in Rome, New York this winter, and you can see the ground where I was standing has no snow. The bridge is snow covered, and that's because cold air often gets underneath bridges and can cause snow and ice buildup on bridges and overpasses. Here's another picture of the same thing. Really good picture here. You can see the ground in the background really has no snow on it. The ground was too warm when we had precipitation, but the bridge actually was able to get accumulation of snow and ice. That's a reason why when we drive around, sometimes we'll see signs that say bridge may ice in cold weather or something like that. So let's talk a little bit about these impacts of ice and what it can look like. Well, one of the impacts obviously is driving around. Last year in the Texas freeze, there was also an ice storm that unfortunately was very fatal. A lot of terrible car accidents can happen all the way down to the Gulf Coast. We're susceptible in places like Atlanta and Baton Rouge and Houston to big ice storms that can cause fatal crashes. And obviously ice buildup in trees and on buildings, they can cause tree falls onto houses. They can also cause a lot of power outages. One of the worst ice storms that I've ever heard about was in Quebec, Canada, and upstate New York in 1998. Look at this map. The darkest blue had almost 4 inches of ice. That's 4 inches of ice. I did not make a mistake there. They had heavy freezing rain for days. This was really a catastrophic storm. Here are some photographs I got from the city of Rouse's Point, New York, that was highly impacted by this event. A lot of times when we think about ice storms, we're thinking about trees going down on power lines. This event was so severe, the power lines themselves just snapped. This is unbelievable. These are pictures. I mean, this was like completely like a war zone. People were out of power for weeks to months. The longest person I met lived in a rural location. They had no power for 6 months. And this is in the wintertime. So how do you heat yourself when you have no power? Again, for a lot of people, no power for at least a couple of weeks. Really severe storm. And then obviously people trying to keep themselves warm. They brought generators in. We always hear about people using generators in a garage or using propane heaters inside and dying from carbon monoxide fumes. This was in Malone, New York, a library. They had a poster about the event, and you could see that it was fatal for people there, unfortunately. Generators are a big thing, whether it's hurricane season or ice storms. And I like this graphic from Generac. They talk about the generator is not being used in a garage or an enclosed space. That's something that we always need to continue education with. We want to warm up our houses, we want to have electricity, but we also don't want these events to be fatal. Another ice storm adaptation is just getting out there before the event, cutting tree branches away from power lines. That can make a big difference when the ice storm hits. You know, what's really interesting, I took this picture in Plattsburgh, New York. In a lot of these upstate New York towns, the power lines have now been buried underground. You can see there are no power lines. The leadership the city or the village historian in Rouse's Point, where I took this picture, he told me before the ice storm of '98, they had actually already buried some of their power lines downtown, but they had a lot of pushback from people saying it's just too expensive. But after the ice storm, downtown was back online, I think in a day or two, or even less, in some cases just hours. And so while other people had weeks of no power, the places with underground lines were back online very quickly. And that convinced everyone just to have the whole town bury their electric lines. So they said sometimes people will learn the hard way, but if you have buried lines and you're in a place that's susceptible to ice storms, it makes your recovery so much quicker. Let's talk about ice jam floods. These are really interesting floods. You never have heard of this before. They're an unusual flood, but in some places in our country, they're very important and very severe. They can happen when we have prolonged cold and dry air, especially in the north central and northeastern states. So the river levels drop, we're really cold, we're freezing our rivers, often right through to the bottom. And we start to get frozen. Obviously, the water starts to freeze in the rivers. In this place, like in the Mohawk River, I took that picture. When all of a sudden the cold and dry pattern changes and we get warm, wet air come up from the south, a lot of heavy rain or a lot of snow melt, all of a sudden that starts to put a lot of water into the rivers. It also breaks up the river ice. And it's something called brash ice. Brash ice is an accumulation of ice from different sources. You can see in this picture, look at these ice chunks. They all look different. It's not smooth, glassy ice. It's really all this chunk ice. Here's another picture of brash ice in the St. Clair River in Michigan. And what can happen as this is flowing downriver, it can basically dam up in something called an ice jam. And when that happens, it can back up water into communities. So this is the St. Clair River in Michigan from an ice jam flood. So this is really what it looks like. You have a city, you have a river, the river has a flow, and where you have a sharp turn in the river, or where you have pinch points or islands, basically this brash ice is going down the river, and all of a sudden where you have a sharp curve, like here in the river, you get an ice jam. And so that actually acts like a dam, and it will back water up upstream back into that city. It's a really unusual kind of flood, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. This is Port Jervis, New York. When I go to see my family, if I take the train, I fly to Newark Airport in New York City, I can take the train to Port Jervis, which is right on the border of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And so this is a city I'm very familiar with. Their worst flood they ever had was from an ice jam flood. You can see the Delaware River here kind of goes along to the south and east. And then there's a really sharp turn just south of Port Jervis and Matamoros, Pennsylvania. And where you have that sharp turn in the river, it backs up flooding. In 1981, their worst flood on record. Everywhere shaded and gray here was flooded in 1981. But you can see it's really from this sharp curve in the river, and then upstream is where they got the ice jam flood. This is a photograph I took this December from Peter Point in Port Jervis, and you can see this is Pennsylvania over here. New Jersey's in the background. The river flows from right to left, but as soon as it passes the city, it does this really sharp 90-degree turn. That's where they get ice jams build up. It can back water back into Port Jervis. 1981, again, their worst flood on record was an ice jam flood there in Port Jervis and Matamoros. And this isn't anything new. This is a picture from 1875. Look at these huge chunks of ice coming down the river. They also had a huge one in 1904. And so these are pictures from 1981. So it says the gorge after ice broke. Sometimes they call this an ice gorge or an ice jam. More commonly, it's called an ice jam. But these are not like rock cliffs. This is all ice that was pushed in. This is not usual. Usually the river's like this at a normal level with just a little bit of ice. But after an ice jam, it's pushed so much ice into the community, it actually looks like a cliff along the river. This is 1981 after the ice jam broke again. So it looked like all just solid white until the ice jam broke and then the river started flowing again. This is taken after the ice jam broke, but look at these huge chunks of ice that pushed into town. Some of the chunks of ice are taller than people. And again, this is flowing into your town. It's hitting buildings, it's crushing cars. It's a strange flood, but it's very catastrophic where it hits. Look at this picture from 1981. This chunk of ice is not as big, but look at the aim on it. It went through a window and it's actually still sitting on the windowsill. So this brings up an interesting question for insurance. If your house was flooded by an ice jam flood, but it's ice that broke the window, do you submit that claim to your flood insurance or to your homeowner's insurance? Because you could argue, well, if that chunk of ice wasn't there, maybe your house wouldn't have flooded so bad. This is what we see a lot in hurricanes as well. Was the flooding from the storm surge that came up, or did the flooding happen first from the hole in your roof and wind-driven rain? This is the same kind of problem you can find with these ice jam floods. You have chunks of ice, but you also have water inundating the community. For adjusters, the work you do is so valuable in these communities. And again, a lot of people will watch the insurance companies fight it out, trying to figure out if this is homeowners or flood insurance. And sometimes we'll actually look back at the first people on the scene. Often it's an adjuster that's the first professional on the scene to document the flood. And really, when you're in that situation, you're basically a detective. You're trying to document everything as quickly as you can and as accurately as you can as well. And so my encouragement to adjusters, the work you do is very valuable, not only to finish the claim and get people's money back, but also to kind of help do the detective work in these complex flood cases. Pay close attention to broken windows. Photograph the window frame and broken glass on the ground if it's still there. You may help provide some clues to find out, was that window broken through moving water or through chunks of ice? Number two, document any abrasion or scrape marks on the building, trees, utility poles. Again, you're a detective on the scene trying to figure out what exactly happened. And again, this is an unusual kind of flood where not only do we have raging water, we also have big chunks of ice. We're trying to put together what happened to help us do better science to predict these things, but also to help the homeowner get their claim processed and paid as well. So 3 unusual things about ice jam floods. Number 1, water and ice are forcing against buildings. Again, this is not your typical flood. It's like you're in the Titanic in the ice-choked North Atlantic, but you're not. You're actually in some community. It's just a really rare event, but it happens. Number 2, in some regions, ice jam floods are more common during droughts and times of low water. So this is really shocking. I found this clip in the Pike County Dispatch back near where my family lives, and the headline says low water caused the flood. There was a community meeting after 1981 where people said, hey, this was not a natural disaster. They were not managing the water well enough in the river. They were letting the water level get too low. And so it became this public debate. Was this a natural event or could it have been prevented? And, could there have been ways that the water levels could have been managed differently? But what shocked me and what I found really ironic and surprising is that the headline says low water caused the flood. When we think of floods, we typically think of high water. We don't think of floods during droughts. But again, you can have an ice jam flood without a drop of rain. You don't need rain. You don't need saturated soil. All you need is river ice breaking up and basically forming an ice jam and backing river water into your community. In Port Jervis, New York, 2 of their 3 biggest ice jam floods happen in severe droughts. Actually, the governor of Pennsylvania issued a drought declaration 3 days before this flood. So they were in very severe drought, and all of a sudden, here comes this flood, not caused by rain, not caused by a hurricane, caused by an ice jam. So the other thing about ice jams, the third thing that's shocking, water levels will change very erratically in an ice jam flood. Look at this log from Matamoros, PA during the 1981 flood. 12:45 a.m., ice jamming below tri-states, the river was beginning to rise. 1:25 a.m., the river level was going down. 2:15, the river's going up. 2:40 a.m., they called the Milford Bridge 7 miles downriver, and they found that the ice and the river was dropping very quickly. Look at this here, 3:25 a.m., the river's coming across the road. 5 minutes later, the river's dropped 3 feet. 10 minutes after that, all hell broke loose. What's literally happening is the water's coming up and going across roads, and then it's dropping 3 or 4 feet, and then it's going up maybe 10 feet. It's unbelievably erratic, depending on how efficient that dam is downriver. And so everybody's on edge, everybody's up, everybody's watching this. Hopefully people have evacuated if they only have one floor. But a lot of times people are up and they're caught in this, and it's very dramatic, and it's I don't know the words for it, but it's just very erratic. It's very hard to predict what's going to happen. Ice jam events from 2016 to 2019, they mostly happen in the north central and northeastern US. You can see this is from the US Army Corps Ice Jam database. They don't happen so much in the Pacific Northwest because even though you get some big winter weather in places like Washington and Oregon, that tends to be with elevation. When you get down to the river levels in, say, Portland or up by Seattle, usually you get occasional freezes and snows, but it's not cold enough in the Pacific Northwest to really freeze the rivers down by the coast. So this is typically north central and northeastern US. Impacts, again, very extensive water and ice impacts. And again, you look at this picture of this car, not only was it flooded, but the doors dented in, and it has a huge slab of ice on the hood. So you're just bringing a lot of ice and water into these communities. Ice jam mitigation, there are two things you can do: pre-event and also reduce impacts during the event. Pre-event, you can cut trees down downstream from your cities. You can cut down trees. You can widen the river channel in places, and you can also make changes to water management. I took this picture downriver of Port Jervis. The US Army Corps worked with the communities to actually cut down trees on several islands. I don't know if this was one of the islands or not, but they did widen the channel downstream, and they cut down trees, which enables these chunks of ice to more go onto land and not be kind of kept in the river. So those are things you can do year round to mitigate against ice jam floods. What about during the event? You want to basically break up this ice jam. Dynamite's been talked about a lot. It was discussed in that public meeting after 1981. The argument against dynamite is that these ice jams, like here's a picture from Connecticut, it's 6 miles of ice-choked river. And the argument is, where would you even charge the dynamite? There's so much ice. What good could dynamite really do? That's usually been the argument, that this is just too extensive for dynamite. And that seems to really make sense to me. Another way that you can mitigate this is putting cranes or heavy machinery on bridges to try to pound the ice. Again, you're just attacking, like one point in this massive area of ice. So that doesn't seem as effective to me. The most effective thing that I've seen so far is what New York's doing along the Mohawk River. They actually have an icebreaker ship and tugboats. I visited this site in December, and these are 2 tugboats that actually go out and they help break up the ice when it's forming. And so what's good about these boats is that they can move through ice and they can be mobile. So they can actually do zigzag patterns and whatever they have to do to get around and break up the ice. This has been very effective actually near Albany and Schenectady in New York. The last thing, I'm not joking about this, bombing the ice jams. We look to our friends in other countries like Russia and Canada. Russia actually bombed, they put Su-34 jets into the air in 2016, and they bombed a 25-mile stretch of the Sukhana River in Russia. You can see the YouTube video on them actually bombing the ice jam. And then in April of 2020, the mayor of Wood Buffalo, Alberta, Canada, requested bombing of a 15-mile ice jam. I don't know of cases where we've bombed in the US, but again, we're trying to save people from being flooded, and I think everything's on the table. Finally, we're going to wrap up this talk by talking about extreme cold weather. So extreme cold weather is something I encountered right away in Alaska. Alaska gets so cold, they plug their cars in. I'm not joking. In Fairbanks, the average high in January is 0. The average low is -18. They get a lot of nights in the 30s below. Your car's not going to start unless it's plugged in. You also see a lot of ice art around places like Fairbanks, where they actually take big chunks of ice from lakes and carve it, and the ice art will stay out there for months. I saw a 5-month period where we only got above freezing for 2 hours. So you get a lot of cold up there. I was a winter sports athlete, so I was excited about this. This is a race I ran in 2006. It's the coldest endurance race I know of. The temperature was -39. There's me in the back in blue. I'm not crazy, so I didn't want to lose my hands or my nose, so I never took off my face mask. My time wasn't even that great. I was just thinking of survival. It was 71 degrees below freezing. I was able to lace up one of my snowshoes. At that point, I completely lost all use of my hands. I have this memory of hitting my hand against a tree. I could see my hand hitting the tree. I couldn't feel a thing. I was able to eventually warm up my hands and run the race. But this was extreme cold. This was in a 3-week period where the temperature was always between -11 and -51. I rode my bike 20 out of 21 days. This was the one day I did not ride my bike. The race was far out of town. I just couldn't see biking out to the race start. There was no way I could warm up. So, but I biked every day to work in that as cold as -51. So I was a winter sports athlete. I really wanted to train my body for those conditions. The reason I'm talking a lot about Alaska, really extreme cold up there, extreme cold in northern Canada, but we have these air masses. In interior Alaska and Canada, we have polar continental air. It's dry, cold air. Polar maritime air is dry, wet, or it's cold, wet air. But these different air masses, you also have tropical maritime and tropical continental. They can be on the move and they can move from place to place. But a source area for cold air is interior Alaska and interior Canada. And that air can very efficiently move all the way down to the Gulf Coast of the US. There's nothing to stop it. The two major things that modify air masses are large bodies of water and big mountain ranges. And if you get down here along the I-10 corridor, say New Orleans over to Houston and Mobile, there's really nothing to stop very cold air from coming all the way to the Gulf Coast and giving you freezes. And you can contrast that with the same latitude. So you go to Cairo, Egypt, you're the same distance from the equator as the I-10 corridor, but you don't get freezes because you have mountain ranges in Europe and you have the Mediterranean Sea modifying the cold air. Again, here in North America, we don't have any huge mountain ranges in the plains, and we don't have any big bodies of water, so the cold air can reach all the way to the coast. We saw this last year at this time here in Texas. We had snow and sleet reach right down to the coast here in Galveston. We had something called the Texas freeze that you may have heard of. It was a catastrophe here in Texas. A lot of broken pipes all the way to the Gulf Coast. Some stats on the Texas freeze. It's a year ago this week, 246 fatalities. Economic damage, $80 to $130 billion in losses. To compare, that might actually be the most catastrophic natural weather event in the history of Texas. Hurricane Harvey was 125 billion. So if you take the upper end of the Texas freeze, it's actually the most costly natural disaster in Texas history. I'm going to wrap up here in just a minute, but there are so many different angles to the Texas freeze. It gets political. People talk a lot about different angles on this story, but a climate angle here without getting political. A lot of people say there's no way we could have known. It's really interesting to look into the climate records in places like Houston and Galveston and College Station, and it's comparing the temperatures that week with what's happened historically. And actually, you can't say this was unprecedented. In the late 1800s, there are two events that were actually colder in Houston, Galveston, and College Station. So this has happened before. It's just a very long time ago. And this is a common thing we see in climatology, that we can't forget our history. There eventually a major hurricane will hit the coast of Georgia. People will say it's never happened. It did happen in the late 1800s. We've just often forgotten about that history. So finally, some ways to mitigate against cold weather. A generator can be helpful. Other options, fireplace, wood stove, other propane heaters. Quickly talking about fireplace and wood stoves, both are thought of as heat sources. They both throw heat, but fireplaces also lose heat. A lot of the heat from your room goes up the chimney. A wood stove is actually more efficient. When you get to places like Alaska and Canada, you won't really see people using a fireplace to heat their houses. They're going to use a wood stove more likely. Also, we want to think about the 4 Ps: people, pets, plants, and pipes. This is all the way down to the Gulf Coast. Our pipes can break. We need to leave them dripping and leave the water running a little bit. Also cover them. Bring pets in, look out for elderly people, and obviously cover our plants all the way down into the deep south. Finally, dressing for the cold, a warm hat. You lose most of your heat through your head. And also, I often have an oversized coat. I can put sweaters and sweatshirts underneath that. I don't need to have a fancy coat that has the liner zipped in. And also, mittens are much better than gloves for keeping your hands warm. And finally, Google base layers. They're thin layers that you can keep under your clothing, and they can keep you a lot warmer wherever you are in the wintertime. You can hear more about these types of stories if you are excited about this presentation today. We have a project that's really funded by CNC called GeoTrek, where we get out into these communities. We learn more about the impacts of extreme weather and natural disasters and ways that we can mitigate them to make ourselves and our communities more resilient. Again, my name is Dr. Hal Needham. I'm a climate data and natural hazard scientist with CNC. I work with the GeoTrek and flood information systems projects. I live in Galveston, but I'm working with a team of great people over in Mobile. There's my phone number. You can call me or text me, or you can shoot me an email at the address below. Everyone, thank you so much for your interest today. I hope you found the presentation exciting. Again, if you learned anything from this, winter weather can affect us no matter where we are, even all the way down on the Gulf Coast. Thanks for your attention. Julie, I don't know if we have any questions that came in, but I'd be happy to field a couple questions now.
I don't see any questions in the chat box.
Okay. I do have a couple questions and I have a couple comments, as usual, of course. First, real quick question, how snowshoe racing, did you really, is that really something you did? Snowshoe racing?
It is, it is. You know, I was on the border of Pennsylvania, New York, and I lived in a town with a population of like 700 people. We had one blinking light. There wasn't a lot to do in the wintertime.
Snowshoe racing.
So snowshoe racing was the
Heard
thing.
of that ever. And I guess it's I guess being in the South, you never hear stuff like that because you never experience it.
I've wondered why it's not an Olympic sport. We have curling, but
Yeah.
snowshoe racing, just getting out and jogging in the snow, not an Olympic sport.
That sounds miserable. I'm just going to tell you. So, but, you know, and I'll kind of, that's one thing about, you know, your presentation stuff. There's a lot of things that even as adjusters, we don't think about in some cases. You know, we're used to wind, we're used to hail, we're used to fires, you know, where it's, you know, nice and hot, and hurricanes in a lot of cases, and disasters like that causing damage and things like that. But we don't really, I mean, there's a select group that out there, yes, they understand about ice dams and you know, and heavy ice on tree limbs. I mean, you know, you get a ice storm, and you know the tree falls, the power goes out, the pipes freeze, and the next thing you know, you have a water loss. You have some type of damage in there. And there's a lot of times that's just kind of overlooked. Obviously, with the Texas storm a couple of years ago, that changed the way a lot of people see things, because that was, like you pointed out, with comparison to Harvey, that was a major disaster. That is something that is often overlooked because usually it happens just in an individual case by case basis. But yes, we have a big event like it happens in Texas, then it becomes more predominant, more I want to say in your face, but more out there on the news, more out there, you know, showing this as what, you know, that's something that's really something as adjusters, you know, like I said, we pay attention to the wind and hails, but this is also an avenue to go down. This is also an avenue to remember, okay, there's a need for adjusters out there to understand the ice dams and understand the brash ice. And you mentioned a flood. Your mom's house had the ice dam on top, and then what she reported as a flood. Well, in the flood industry, that's technically not a flood. So like you point out, you have your homeowners adjuster, you have your flood adjuster, and you got to come to a definition of a flood, you know, a general and temporary condition of flooding, partial inundation, complete inundation, 2 or more acres of land or 2 or more properties. So in order for that to have occurred, it would have had to reach another property, then back to the insurable property in order for that to be covered. So, but the reason I bring that up, not just because tell you that, you know, that's incorrect, but that's as an adjuster, we have to understand that stuff, and we have to be able to explain those things. Go, okay, hey, I need to meet with the homeowners adjuster. I'm the flood adjuster. I need to meet with the homeowners adjuster. And here's the reason why we go down that path. You know, I thought it was funny you showed that article about the ice chunk, and not the tall one, but the one in the window. And if you read up there in the corner, it said damages to house are $2,780. I'm like, today's day, today's
supply. That was a long time ago.
That's 100 times up there. But you also made a good point on that as well. What caused that? Who's responsible for that? Is that the homeowners, or is that going to be a flood if they had flood insurance? And the thing is, in that situation, I'm a flood adjuster, and in my experience has always been in the flood realm, the flood world. I mean, I do have the property knowledge stuff, but heavily in the flood. But if I'm the adjuster, that is to be a flood claim, because the flood actually picked the item up and pushed it into the house. and cause the damage. Almost like a flood, a flood picks up a boat and pushes it into the house and causes the damage. I'd be paying for that. But you made the valid point, as you need to get with the homeowner's policy, the homeowner's adjuster, and make sure we're not duplicating coverages or duplicating payments on these claims. So that was very important. And it kind of brought me back to a situation. So the ice chunk hitting the house under the National Flood Insurance Program, as long as it's picked up by the flood and pushed into the house, would be considered direct physical loss. But I'm going to throw another one out there that kind of throws people off. If the water causes the tree to be undermined and the tree falls on the house, is that direct physical loss? And the answer is no, it's not. But the water actually never pushed the tree into the house, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So
and
just
Frank, some of these chunks of ice are bigger than cars, right? So they could absolutely take down trees.
yeah.
Yeah, you're thinking
And
right.
now we have a
It's
different
very
situation.
complex.
The water pick the tree up and move it into the house. So yeah, so there's all kind of things as adjusters. You're giving us some really valuable information to think about as you're out there, especially when you're dealing with stuff that you normally don't deal with: ice, snow melt, even snow melt. Snow melt is covered. Snow melt causes a general and temporary condition flooding. It's covered in the National Flood Insurance Program. But there's things like that we sometimes overlook as an adjuster. We don't pay attention to those because we don't deal with them on a day-to-day basis. But your insight into all this, you start thinking a little bit more. And as you're showing me these slides, I'm looking at damage, covered, not covered, covered. And that's how I start analyzing all those things. And so I really appreciate, again, taking the time to come on and give us that other insight into something that, sometimes we don't think about. So I know we're out of time, and Julie jumped on, so I don't know if she
Yes,
has more questions.
we've had a
or
couple
we're
of
just ready to
questions come up, and I was going to ask you, we are out of time. Do you want me to have them email them and I can send them to Hal, or go ahead and ask?
Well, no, I said
Okay.
go ahead. If people need to jump off, they need to
So
jump off. And
are the residents
time, but-
affected by the ice jams required to have flood insurance as well as homeowners and commercial insurance?
I can answer part of that one. Okay, if you are in a flood zone and you're required to have flood insurance, then yes, you absolutely have to have flood insurance. If you do not live in a flood zone, let's say if you live in a next zone, your insurance program in a flood zone, it is very valuable for everybody to actually have flood insurance, because you never know what point in time you're actually going to flood. So I kind of answer that part. I'll let Hal answer the other part.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, yeah, I don't really have much to add to what Craig said, except in some of these places, ice jam floods are the worst floods they've ever seen. So it's something we absolutely need to consider when we make the flood maps or look at flood risk.
And you on your slides earlier, you showed that river downstream, well, upstream from there, where the water ends up going, they may not be in a flood zone. Down here they may be, but this is where the ice jam occurs. But up here, it's good to have flood insurance. If you live around a body of water or something, there's probably a good chance sometime you're going to flood.
And Craig, that's a good point. You need to look at the map and say, wow, if there's a sharp curve in a river and you live in the north central or northeastern states, you could absolutely see an ice jam there, backwater up into your community.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I have another question. When an ice dam is broken by bombing or dynamite, wouldn't that cause more damage to areas downstream because too much water is rushing in at one time? That's a good question.
It's a great question. I talked to the emergency management coordinator in Port Jervis, New York on this podcast that will be releasing. Thanks. I lost a TV monitor back. That's okay. It's not violent winds. We don't have a hurricane here today. That was we'll talk about the claims for this later. No, I talked to the emergency management coordinator for Port Jervis, New York, and he said one of the concerns with blasting the ice is that it's going to affect someone downriver. So that's a great question, and it's something to consider. You still have the same amount of ice. Will that affect people downriver?
And I'll throw a disclaimer out there. Do not try to blow up your own ice. Okay. Don't attempt to use dynamite. Are you all right?
Fine. It's all good. TV's hit me every day, so I'm used to it.
Um,
All right, is that it?
we are having some questions about adjusting. If you have adjusting questions or want to work with CNC, you can email me or HR or Craig. But I'll put my email address in the chat box, or you can go to adjustingexpectations.com. Okay.
That works. That works, perfect. Okay. All right, that's it. No more questions. Again, I want to thank everybody for your time, for joining us today. Well, every other Thursday, we have I was about to say flood news at noon, because I'm used to saying that, but every other Thursday, we have our CNC's Claims Corner. And again, Hal, thank you for taking the time. Thank you for your insight, your perspective, your expertise, and all this. We really appreciate your time, and I hope everyone has a fantastic day, and we'll see y'all again in 2 weeks. Thanks, everybody. See y'all next Thursday. See y'all in 2 weeks. Bye. Thanks, Hal.
Thank you.